Welcome to Xagility. I'm your host, John Coleman. Matthew Skelton, welcome to the Xagility Podcast. How are you doing today?
Thank you. Well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Delighted to have you here, Matthew. I've been looking to talk to you for a while, so delighted to talk to you. And we're going to talk about two of your books. And the first book was from 2019, Team Topologies, Organising Business and Technology Teams for Fast Flow by yourself and Manuel Pace. And the foreword was by Ruth Malan. And there's another book, a follow-up book, which I guess is a kind of a post-pandemic kind of catch-up book because of, the whole world has changed now. We're so much remote interaction. So it's a Remote Team Interactions Workbook by yourself and Manuel Pace. And the subline would be using team topologies patterns for remote working. So essentially, if people are looking at team topologies in this day and age, my understanding is they need to look at both of these books, really.
It'd be useful. The Remote Team Interactions Workbook is effectively a bit like an appendix to the Team Topologies book, exactly. So the pair of them work really, really well together. Although the nature is a bit different. The first book, Team Topologies, is where the key ideas are laid out and some case studies, whereas the workbook is more of a practical thing. We've got lots of exercises and things to try. So it's a nice combination.
Yeah, so first thing I want to say is that the feel of the book is really, really good. It's very colorful, not just in the images on the inside. I love the legends. It actually makes it much easier to read, even circles, colors. Even when you flick through it, it reminds me of when I was a student at university. You know, you can flick through the specific versions of the book to find out what you want to get to.
So that was very deliberate, and we were really pleased to be able to work with IT Revolution, the publisher, to get a full colour printed version out for the main book. For lots of reasons, it makes it more appealing, but you'll see in there kind of a visual language. We've actually developed the visual language a bit since the book was published, but it really helps people to get to grips with the ideas. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that later, but we were also keen to make the book work for people with different learning styles. Some people have got a very visual learning style, and we've tried to include different types of material presented in different ways in the book to appeal to like kind of the widest range of audience, I guess.
And in the book, in page 12, you got a reference to the obstacles to fast flow. And if I list them out here, all very colorfully done. Pushing against Conway's law. We'll talk about Conway's law in a minute. Software too big for teams. Confusing org design options. Team pulled in many directions. Painful reorg every few years. That'll ring a bell for lots of people. It reminds me of the joke of the three envelopes for executives. Flow is blocked. Too many surprises and disengaged teams. So is Team Topologies optimized then for fast flow, or is it just a very important part of it?
Team Topologies aims to address all of those problems, all of those blockers that you just identified there. What Team Topologies is trying to do is acknowledge that in an organization that is building software-enriched services, so that is, there's some software in the mix. It might not be the whole service or product offering that is offered by that organization, but the software is a key part of it. In these kind of organizations, in this context, particularly with modern software, we're using cloud, we're using modern tooling and so on, then there is not just a competitive advantage for going quickly, but it's actually an existential need. Because if you don't get to the point where you have a fast flow of changes into the services that you're running, then a competitor will come along and eat your lunch. So we need to acknowledge that this combination of software and people is what we call a sociotechnical system. There's a dynamic between the humans, the people in the organization, and the kind of systems that we're building. And therefore, we need to think about these two things together. We can't just think about the technology. We can't just think about the people. We have to think about the relationship and the dynamic between the technology and the people that we've got in the organization. That's the route to making healthy, sustainable approaches to building and running these kind of services over the extended period. Because modern software is never finished. Modern software is only finished when we retire that product or service, when that product or service is no longer available to customers or users, which means that we've got effectively a continuous approach to everything. We're using techniques like continuous delivery, but think about continuous design, continuous funding, a very much continuous approach rather than a discrete project-led approach. And therefore, Team Topologies sits in this context. Modern software services, they're never going to be finished. They're always evolving. We need to think about the health of the services that we're building, the health of the teams. We need to expect there to be rapid, fast flows of change, multiple separate streams of change across the organization for different services, because we're not going to coordinate them all into one big bang release process. That's from the 1990s. And be realistic about what makes us human. We've got a limited working memory, and that then means that there's a limited amount of information we keep in our heads at any one time. And that could be a good thing, but it could also be a challenge. It means we can't just expect people to work across any different part of the software at the same time. So bringing all this stuff together then means we're expecting to set up a set of constraints, effectively constraints on organizational behavior, ways in which teams interact and do work, which then lead to good outcomes. The outcomes that we're expecting to lead to is we've got multiple rapid flows of change to these software services to allow teams to make changes to software tens or hundreds of times in a single day. We've got a sense of ownership around the software that they're producing, so that we're empowering them to make localized decisions that make sense for particular services or products. Because that kind of distribution of knowledge out to what some people call the nodes, if you like, but out to individual teams, is the only way to run an organization in the context where there's lots of things changing. You can't have centralized control and centralized planning in a context where the environment is changing, and the environment is very much changing quickly. Literally, the physical planet environment is changing. We've seen wildfires and heat waves and torrential floods and things like this. All of that stuff is driving. So the climate change is driving political change, is driving trading change. All of this stuff together is making for a lot of uncertainty. We can't predict what's going to happen. Therefore, the organizations need to be responsive and adaptive. And the way we be responsive and adaptive is to embed awareness at the team level. At one level, that's what Team Topologies is doing, embedding awareness at the team level to help these teams reshape boundaries for fast flow. Because if we have that in place, then we're able to get value to our customers on an ongoing basis as we adapt the organization.
You reminded me there, Matthew, of a TED talk I saw. I watched quite frequently from Yves Mariot. He was a BCG consultant, not sure if he's still there. And he shows the World Athletics Final women's relay race. And I remember seeing the United States against France, and I was kind of wondering which team was going to win, you know. I observed that the French team seemed to have more camaraderie and all that kind of stuff. And the US team that year, that particular team, seemed to be very individualistic. The people in the team seemed to be individualistic. And I was curious, even though on paper the American team would win by 6.4 meters, would they beat the French team? And the French team actually won the race, and the whole point.
Interesting.
Whole point from Yves Mariot is that don't measure how fast people are running, measure how well they're cooperating, and actually no metric on earth can measure passing the baton effectively and so on. So what I love in your book is it's all about cooperation and collaboration, but at the same time, it's not about everybody talking to everyone, which can create another type of overload, right?
Indeed, exactly. Historically, there are some organizations or some people recommending, we just need to get everyone to collaborate, we need to get everyone to talk to each other better, and assuming that that's somehow the solution. And obviously, if you've got an organization where no one talks to anyone else and all the activities in tiny little silos, then yes, a bit more talking is going to help. But ultimately, it doesn't scale. You can't have everyone talking to anyone else because it just creates a kind of gridlock of interconnection, which then prevents flow. Like if there was no need for fast flow, then fine. Okay, have people talking to anyone else and just doing things at a really slow pace. Maybe that's fine. In the context of fast flow, we need a design which works for flow, multiple separate flows of change across the organization. And so on that basis, then we need to use collaboration a bit more strategically. So collaboration then for us in the Team Topologies book is principally about finding good boundaries for flow. So two teams working together for a specific period of time to adjust their boundaries, maybe to define a new service or to define the parameters around that service or define how they define the user experience of consuming that service, maybe. But then, so they might work together for a couple of days or weeks. But actually that collaboration there is quite kind of costly, expensive. It's quite involved. And you might have two groups of people with two different sets of skills. And so it gets quite, if you like, there's an overhead, but it also feels like kind of maybe emotionally draining as human beings for a period. But hey, if we're only doing it for a few days or weeks, we can deal with that because the outcome will be that we've discovered something new, discovered how to use a piece of technology better or how this boundary needs to sit or whatever. And at that point, we can then move back from that really close, intense collaboration into a model which is maybe more like one team is providing something and one team's consuming something as a service, which scales much better. So Team Topologies introduced the idea of team interaction modes between different types of team, which helps us to think about interactions across the organization in a way which is much more kind of considered and deliberate. We've got patterns for different types of interaction at different times, depending on what we're trying to achieve. So it provides a kind of language or grammar for describing that and describing the benefits of using different approaches at different times.
Indeed, yeah. We're going to come back to that again later on. Just take a step back for the moment. It seems like Team Topologies is inspired by, for example, systems thinking, the Conway sense-making framework. I think DevOps, reading between the lines as well, because there's a lot of reference to DevOps in there as well. But also cybernetics is mentioned in there in Conway's Law. We'll talk about Conway's Law later on. But for the audience out there, what is cybernetics and why? What is it about cybernetics that inspired the work on Team Topologies?
So cybernetics is, the word cybernetics actually comes from a Greek word which means a person who steers the ship, which weirdly, for those of you who are from an IT background, it's the same root of the word as Kubernetes and the same root for the word government. The word cybernetics, Kubernetes and government all come from the same Greek word, kybernos, which means the person who is steering the ship. So it's the person who's steering this thing, a sense of direction. And cybernetics is all about effectively self-steering of systems. And systems become self-steering when they have feedback and we can act on that feedback. We can inspect the state of the real system and kind of feed it back into the intent, the control part of the system, and then adjust the control to make the output change. So this is classically, if you've got an old style heating system in your house, you've got a thermostat on the wall and you set that to say 15 degrees Celsius, and then you wait for the boiler to fire up and heat the house, and then it reaches 15 degrees, and then the heating clicks off. That's a cybernetic system because there's something detecting the temperature. It feeds back, and eventually the heating system clicks off. That's one of the more simple examples. But what's kind of surprising, well, the reason we wanted to include these kind of, to be honest, relatively basic kind of feedback principles in the book is because there's so many organizations that don't actually work and think like that. There's lots of organizations that plan a whole load of work and then they say, right, let's deliver this. And then they don't listen to what's actually happening to those services or the result of that work. They don't make any course correction. They don't do any steering based on the success or relevance or usefulness of the things that they pushed out there. So effectively, they're blind. They're just pushing stuff out there and carrying on and not caring. And actually taking an approach which is, inspired by cybernetics, where we're consciously expecting to have to detect the result of our actions actually sets us up for success in this kind of more uncertain context where things are changing, external things are changing, internal things are changing a lot of the time. We need to expect what we're doing to maybe not be quite right. And so we say, well, okay, we've done this thing. Let's check. Let's see what's actually happened. Let's use some metrics or telemetry or some kind of other kind of feedback, bring that back into the organization, and then we can adjust. And actually that mindset is so fundamentally different. The kind of deliver this batch of things, project-based mindset is very different from this mindset which says, well, we think this might be the right thing to do. Let's try a little thing, test it, and then adapt. And those mindsets are really fundamentally very, very different. And so bringing in that kind of adaptive mindset felt really important. And that's partly what Team Topologies helps enable, helps to kind of instill that across the organization. This more kind of inspect and adapt approach.
Thank you, Matthew. And also in the book you mentioned as well about the influence of DevOps tooling for software, say IT teams, and how it can be often quite easy for organizations to implement the tooling and, for example, do continuous delivery, continuous integration, all these sort of things. But the culture tends to be a kind of more long-term, more difficult thing. And I noticed in the book as well that you did work on DevOps. Is it DevOps topologies earlier on, and Manuel, I believe, extended that later on. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, about your experience with organizations with tooling and their culture change in your earlier days of doing DevOps transformation, for example?
Well, I'll rewind to the very beginning of my industry experience. So I started work as a software developer back in 2001. So this is that's 22 years ago now. I was building software for brain imaging machines. And at that particular organization, there's only 5 of us, I think, developing software. But at the time, this is before the use of version control, or before the common use of version control. And we would just copy the files onto a shared server every night. And then sometimes we'd be overwriting each other's changes and all this kind of nonsense. So it was quite clear to me back then we needed to introduce some kind of tool to help us. And so I brought in like a very early version control system. The world was different then, but it helped a bit. But what was interesting is that there were people with mental models that couldn't adjust, or that found it very difficult to adjust to a different way of working. Even though having a version control tool was actually really useful because it helped to deal with merge conflicts and all this kind of stuff. It was the kind of cultural shift, people's acceptance of a need to change, which then was the harder part to bring in. and then I went on to do other work for various different sectors, engineering and then local government and then commercial stuff and financial organizations and blah, blah, blah. Introducing version control at pretty much every organization there that I worked for, or improving the version control approach. And then I ended up being a build and deployment architect at a retailer in the UK. So I was in the middle of, this was just before the retailer, this is back in 2011, just before the retailer was starting to adopt cloud. They're still in physical data centers, but we're starting to use more automation and this kind of thing. And so I was involved in bringing in all kinds of tooling that related to automation and seeing the relationship between those tools and how people adopted them and how people had to adapt to a new way of working and all this kind of stuff. We were thinking about ownership of different code repositories. We were thinking about a deployment pipeline. We had to build out an internal data center for testing purposes using VMware, virtual machines. We did a whole bunch of like diagnosing network connections from London to India and a whole bunch of this kind of stuff. I was in the middle of all of this with me and my team, small team, seeing the effect of different kind of tools on teams, on interactions, seeing the effect of a tool where let's say the access boundaries, the access rights to that tool were limited to a certain group, and the effect that had on ability to have flow all the way through to production. And rethinking a whole load of these kind of things, like saying, well, look, why don't we switch around who has access to this particular tool so that it can stretch all the way to the live environment? What's going to be the implication of that? Having to then have conversations with the security architect, with the head of IT operations, blah, 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 to enable this stuff to happen, to enable this kind of switch. And seeing the effect that, well-intentioned deployments of tools can have a strong kind of braking or a strong preventative effect on more effective ways of working. So people might limit the access to a particular tool for like what seems like a good reason. But because they've done that, it means we can't get, let's say, end-to-end flow of changes all the way to production. And so the kind of conversation we need to have then, it exposes a need to think more holistically about how these tools sit inside our organization to enable us to be much more effective end-to-end holistically. So that was quite a useful experience. And a lot of that work then ended up, also some of the thinking from that work ended up in a blog post that I've published in October 2013. It's nearly 10 years ago now. I'll actually be doing a keynote DevOps Days Oslo in October on pretty much exactly the 10th anniversary of that blog post. Now that blog post then went kind of viral at the time, and it was picked up by lots of different organizations around the world, including Netflix and Condé Nast International, big publishing house, and big IT consultancies like Accenture, kind of all found it really useful to think through these different patterns. And the blog post that I put there was different options for software development teams and IT operations teams to work together. Because back in the day, back in 2013, DevOps meant how do we get developers and operations working together effectively? It meant some other things too. Now DevOps means like automation tooling and deployment pipelines and stuff. It's become a very pale imitation of the meaning of the term 10 years ago. But anyway, so different patterns for these two different kind of teams to work together and why they might be effective, and exploring what it meant to collaborate certain times. When would collaboration be good? When would it not be good? They started to think about transition. So we might have a temporary team helping to bring two other teams together, working on some things for a period of time. And then if it's temporary, it's okay. But if it's long-term, then it becomes a silo, and so on and so on. It looks like a series of Venn diagrams, and you'll find it online at DevOpsTopologies.com. And it's still being used. But the thinking that we did around that and some of the further research that we did on this, we did research for quite a few organizations, including a large Chinese company with like 70,000 people worldwide or something. Did quite a lot of work around in this space. What came out of that was what then became team topologies. So we distilled and coalesced a lot of thinking around kind of effective patterns in the DevOps context, distilled that out and kind of generalized it a little bit into what then became the team topology stuff. And so definitely at the heart of the thinking of team topologies is awareness that, yes, again, it's sociotechnical. The way that tools and teams and people interact, it's not just one way. We can't just deploy tools without thinking about the effect on people, and vice versa. There's a dynamic there. That's very much part of the thinking, is how the technology tools will have an effect on teams and organizational effectiveness and vice versa. They need to be thought of. We need to think about tools and teams together, not as two separate things.
Thank you, Matthew. So chapter 2 of the book here, I can see Conway's law and why it matters, and I'll just read it out and what Conway's law is. It creates an imperative to keep asking, is there a better design that is not available to us because of our organization? So essentially, it was about the structure of your product or your outputs will essentially be a manifestation of the structure of your organization. That's the way my layperson's understanding of it. And you talk about Conway's law a lot, and the inverse, or what you now call, I think, the reverse Conway Manoeuvre, which is about, I think it's about essentially trying to think about how we're organized in terms of how the product is likely to be structured, essentially. And it's an IT system that might be an architecture. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and maybe correct my understanding if I got that a little bit wrong?
So Conway's law comes from this 1968 paper from the engineer Mel Conway, who had worked in, I think, the US Navy and a few other places, maybe IBM, I think. And he made this observation that there's a kind of mirroring effect between the shape of it's technically the communication pathways inside the organization and the kind of architecture of the system that gets produced. Now, this has been verified in several different sectors. So it's been verified in the IT industry for enterprise software. Interestingly, not for open source software. Open source software seems to have a bit of a different dynamic, which is kind of understandable because it's about individuals contributing more on a personal interest basis. So, but generally speaking, on the corporate software where we've got a much more coherent group of people working at the same time towards a common goal, then it applies there. But it also applies in automotive sector, so building cars and vehicles. If you've got people working on, if the communication pathways don't align with the kind of the technical interfaces, the physical interfaces between different parts of the system, there's a danger that you get quality mismatches. And it's also been found to apply in jet engine manufacture as well. So there have been various studies to look at this mirroring effect. And the implication is, if you don't think about the shape of the organization, there's a danger that you're fighting against this mirroring tendency as you're trying to build these systems. That's the danger. Like, do you want to be fighting against that kind of what seems to be a kind of natural force, or do you want to go with it? Do you want to go with the grain, if you like, go with the flow, or do you want to be effectively working against that all the time? And so our suggestion is you don't want to work against it. You should be going with the grain, if you like, a bit like the grain of the wood. And so combine that with this need for fast flow. We need to have teams that have end-to-end responsibility for a particular service or product, because that's what the nature of modern software is it's 24/7. We need people. The people who build it should be the people who run that software. They should be the same people who understand what's happening in the live environment now. Oh, look, the checkout payment processor thing has just crashed. We're losing $10,000 a minute. The people who've built it are the ones with the most context about how it actually works. Let's get them involved in diagnosing that production incident and getting to fix straight away. And then once we understand the fix, and we've done the triage, well, let's put the fix in place right now. Let's not wait for another 3 weeks or 3 months to get the fix in place. Let's do it right now where we've got the context. And so that you build it, you run it approach, which has been used at Amazon Web Services for 20 years, gives the fastest feedback, gives the most context for the teams building this stuff. So there's an implied architecture for flow where we've got multiple separate services, autonomous and decoupled from each other, with a loose kind of integration using asynchronous messages. This is good software architecture. Good software architecture fundamentally is decoupled services, asynchronous communication, clearly defined boundaries. This stuff has been known since the 1960s, if not before. So there's nothing new particularly here. It's just that the industry had lost sight of that in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. So we need to have this, generally speaking, this kind of multiple different decoupled services, nice clearly defined boundaries, asynchronous communication, generally speaking. So that's our kind of architecture. We align it to the flows of change, the value streams. Yeah. And that's what our team should look like as well. And so Conway's law then is suggesting we need to avoid this kind of mirroring effect, or the negative kind of mirroring. But if we combine that with this need for flow, then we've got a kind of architecture for our organization and for our software systems that it's not exactly templated, but it looks a particular way. It looks, as I said, multiple different services, decoupled, asynchronous communication. And so we can expect that then to give us the best outcomes in terms of, we're pretty confident now we're not fighting against Conway's law at this point.
Yeah, in the book, you've already mentioned the Streamlined team. And of course, you also have a complicated subsystem team, which some people might call a component team. And then there was an enabling team as well, which might be part-time as well. So sometimes there might be something that's so big that might actually need its own setup where it's providing a platform as a service, if you like, to the streamlined teams. And that then requires different types of collaboration, which you talked about in the book. And you had, for example, collaboration, which is about high intensity and mutual respect, but that's limited to one team at a time. If you're collaborating, you're collaborating with one team at a time. So I guess that's to reduce the load there as well. And you also had as a service, where the emphasis uniquely, I think, for team topologies is developer experience. So it's about, so if I'm in value stream, for example, and I'm using a platform as a service, the people in the platform team are considering me as a developer, trying to give me the experience that a lot of people in product would say a UX person would care about how the user is using the product. Team topologies is cares about how the developers are experiencing the platform. That was at least my understanding of that. And then there was facilitating, where it's about help and be helped. So you've got very simple patterns for people to be organized, but also very good legends and graphics in terms of how could you actually visualize how we could be organized, so we could take Conway's law into account, but at the same time try to minimize cognitive load. Is there anything that you want to add to that, or maybe correct in what I've just said there, Matthew?
So we wanted to provide language and some clear patterns. And maybe this language and patterns is, I wouldn't say simplistic, but it's like taking a big marker pen, and it has a big, kind of thick line, a thick, fat line around the diagram. There's no shades here, and that's deliberate. It's deliberate because what we found before is there's so many people were so miserable, unhappy in these large organizations because they didn't know what they were supposed to be doing. They didn't know why they were working together with this other team here for like 7 weeks. There's no clear way to talk about different types of working together. And so that's what we did. We put together these 3 different interaction modes: collaboration, X as a service, and facilitating. 3 very different ways to work together with other teams, but they have different flavors, different purposes, and different feelings. Ultimately, we wanted to address how it feels to work inside organizations building and running software. Like, we want to address the human emotional element as well. And so we can start to say, look, yes, so you're going to be collaborating with this other team here for the next, let's say, 3 days. It's going to feel really intense. It might be a bit uncomfortable, but hey, don't worry about it, because we expect to find the solution to this slightly tricky API problem in about 3 days, after which point it'll feel a bit easier again because you'll be mostly back inside your own team. Or, hey, for the next week, we're going to get some facilitation from a team of machine learning experts. So they're coming in, they've got a background in, PhD in mathematics or data analytics or whatever. It's going to be a bit intense, right? But at the same time, these people are going to mentor us. They're not going to be teaching us. They're not going to be doing the work for us. They're going to help us understand new things. So we need to be ready for that kind of new learning. So we can set expectations about different points in time. That directly relates to kind of what it feels like as people to be involved in these different kind of activities. And that was deliberate. That's a really important part of why we define these different kind of teams and different types of interactions between them. And it feels like this is the kind of minimum set of, if you like, a minimum richness of diversity for types of team and types of interactions to enable us to start to express how, or start to express and maybe constrain how this sociotechnical system actually operates, how it works. This combination of people and technology that comes together in the sociotechnical system inside the organization, it seems to provide just enough what we call enabling constraints to help to nudge this kind of system to have more healthy behaviors and better outcomes. That's what's really going on.
I wanted to ask you, Matthew, about enabling teams. A couple of questions I have for you on those, right? So, because you mentioned in the book, enabling teams should avoid becoming ivory towers, and I agree, that we should avoid that. But how do you avoid that? I'm just curious what you've noticed, and also some of these enabling teams seem to have part-time team members. What's the rationale behind that?
The enabling team is a group of people with particular expertise. It might be a mixture of expertise, or it might be pretty much all the same type of expertise. Maybe it's all in machine learning, or maybe it's a mixture of expertise to help people get to grips with continuous delivery deployment pipelines, for example. That's the specific example that we've got in the book. The case study we've got in the book is around a group of people with a mixture of different backgrounds helping teams to adopt continuous delivery. But whatever the expertise is, the point there is that the way in which that enabling team works, they work in a facilitating way. They help a streamlined team to adopt new ways of working, to adopt a new tool, to help them to use a particular tool set better, or to learn how to do new type of coding, to learn about a domain. You might have an enabling team of legal experts. They're not even technologists. They come in, they help streamline teams to understand some aspect of a legal domain so they can build their services better. So, and it's deliberately short term. It's a short term interaction. They might work with the streamlined team. The enabling team might work with the streamlined team for like a few days or maybe a couple of weeks, but they're not there permanently. They're not there as a crutch, because we want the streamlined team to be independent and decoupled as much as possible. So, and the enabling team is not building anything itself. The enabling team is also not specifying things for other people to follow. The enabling team is not checking what other people do. So the way in which we measure the contribution of the enabling team is the extent to which these capabilities are uplifted in streamlined teams. So if we've got an enabling team around security, to what extent have you now managed to get 10 streamlined teams to improve their security practices? And we can test that by running checks on their code and a bunch of other things. To what extent have you managed to get them to uplift their security practices on a, let's say, 3-month or 6-month basis? So the success of the enabling team then is measured by these other measures in other teams, based on this need to keep those other teams, the streamlined teams, decoupled, independent, autonomous. And so we can put some incentives in place like that, avoiding this sense in which these experts are there to dictate what happens or to specify what happens. They're there to listen and see what's happening, and if necessary, to help provide some kind of accelerators. So let's say a 5-page PDF or like a wiki page or something. Here's how to get started with this particular security approach in 5 minutes. This is what you need to know. And if they're condensing their knowledge and expertise in ways which help to keep these streamlined teams aware and capable and decoupled, then that's where we need them to be. So to answer your question, it's about thinking about the kind of incentives that we need to put in place for these experts in these enabling teams to help them do that kind of job, rather than sometimes a traditional role, which was either ivory tower or was a kind of gatekeeper or kind of checking the work of other people. Taking that, we're not getting rid of that expertise. We're taking that expertise, but using it in a way which helps improve flow, helps flow to happen, multiple flows of change to happen. So multiple different teams are deploying stuff all the time, deploying changes every day to production, whilst being secure, performant, managing risk properly, compliant, all the rest of it. We're still tracking those things. It's just that we're doing it in a way which responds to this need for fast flow. And there's no way that a group of experts can specify everything across the whole organization. That would slow things down so much. They need to be listening to what teams are doing, responding to that by providing other things, whether it's like, quick start guides, accelerators, or potentially speaking to the platform and saying, look, we need a service around this. We need to make it really easy for teams to do this thing, preparing data for machine learning or becoming more compliant in this area or something. And then the platform can then go and provide that service for teams to consume. So enabling teams technically act as a boundary spanning activity. That's what they're involved in. For those people who are familiar with organization design, they're effectively boundary spanning. They're doing that listening and sensing and detecting, as well as increasing the capabilities inside streamlined teams through their expertise.
It makes a lot of sense. And you go to a lot of trouble in the book as well of explaining some of the expected behaviors as well from each of these types of team. Also, you're honest as well about the advantages and disadvantages of the different ways of interacting between teams. But then towards the end of the book, there's a kind of reference to being all together or remote first. That's where I want to go next. Actually, the second book that you wrote was workbook, rather, Remote Team Interactions Workbook. It's really for, I guess it's as you mentioned earlier on in the interview, it's an add-on, if you like, an appendix to the original book with remote in mind, because a lot of teams these days are working remotely. Very first thing that came up in the book that I spotted was the 5 dynamics that you took away from Google's research. Was it the Aristotle study that time, where they noted that one of the dynamics was psychological safety. That was really key. Dependability, structure and clarity, the meaning of work and impact of work. And I guess that kind of ties in a lot with team topologies. And then you talked well about tracking dependencies. And I found this very, very interesting, because I never heard anybody else talking about blocking types, like dependencies that are slowing you down versus ones that are maybe stopping you. Maybe also showing items that actually don't have any dependencies. And you also talked about over communicating with just enough documentation, and you even have team APIs as examples in the workbook of team APIs where you can say as your team, how do you contact us? What's our preferred channel? You even have little tips on, if you use chat tools, what conventions you can use, because if everybody's talking to everybody, it's just going to cause complete overload on Slack, for example. And you even talked about separate online spaces, and it's really very practical. You even have a thing here about a practical wiki. How do you contact us? Here's a simple example of how you use our stuff. How quickly do we respond? What's our roadmap in terms of what we're looking at? In a sense, what you've done, I think, is to kind of use Bent Flyberg's language in the book, How Big Things Get Done. I think what you try to do is essentially try to Legoize how we're organized, so that our work is much more consumable and easy to interact with each other. How do you feel about that interpretation, Matthew?
I think that's fairly close. I mean, given that many organizations are incredibly dysfunctional in terms of how they work internally and how people can communicate, it's almost like any standard set of patterns and language would have been an improvement. I'm sure someone could probably come up with an alternative to Team Topologies way of doing it, and that would also be equally useful. But anyway, we're talking about Team Topologies here today. And so that's definitely part of what we wanted, a language and an approach which then can be rich enough to encourage the right kind of useful kind of conversations and interactions across the organization. And of course, that speaks to the research from Google about healthier teams and happier teams and work being more fulfilling and being able to master the work. That comes from teams having a long-lived focus on one or maybe 2 or 3 different areas on an ongoing basis. They can then feel like they're actually having a useful mission and purpose around a small number of things that they can get to grips with. And they're empowered to make sensible decisions about how to make changes in that space. And part of having that kind of autonomy and empowerment is about defining the role of that team and how it works and how we want to do things. And that's where the idea of a team API came up. So API, application programming interface, super technical term, comes from software. It basically specifies how one bit of software talks to another bit of software. That's all it is. Imagine you've got a plug and a wall socket for electricity. Around the world, there's lots of different kind of plugs and wall sockets. Like in the UK and Ireland, we've got a 3-pin one. I think nowhere else in the world uses that. There might be a couple of other places, but basically that's it. You can't just plug it straight into a socket in Europe. This is the API. The API needs to be compatible. It needs to click. It needs to slot in effectively. And you specify the API and say, look, if you want to work with us, this is the best way to work with us. This is how this is going to work. And we're deliberately using a technical term for teams because, for a start, we're coming from this kind of IT software delivery background. And that's our starting point. That's how we know that this kind of approach really works. So basically, all the people involved in using these bodies inside an IT context will probably know what API means. But increasingly, actually, API is quite common outside of that, like the API economy and all this kind of stuff. It's become more familiar. All it means is a specification for how to interact with us. That's all it means. And just by defining that, just saying, look, we've got our team stand up between 9 and 10 every morning. Please don't contact us then. Don't expect a response in that window. That immediately makes it easy for other people to say, okay, that's a reasonable thing. So even if I send a message during that time, I'm not going to get a response back for another 50 minutes. So you're immediately setting expectations that are then more reasonable. You're avoiding other people getting frustrated or this kind of thing. So it's just a way of trying to define things, trying to make things a bit better defined so that the communication becomes more defined. We know from building software systems that defining the protocols of communication is the way that this stuff works. And by applying some of that logic into the workplace with teams, we're able to then it helps us have a conversation. That's what the Team API ultimately is doing. It helps us have a conversation because we specify something. We say, this is what we expect. We're currently working with these teams in this way. We expect next week or 2 weeks' time to be working with these other teams. If you lay it out and set some expectations, if someone looks at this and goes, well, actually, that doesn't feel right, blah, 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 fine. Have a conversation, have a chat about it and work it through. But this idea of being more, having templates effectively and language to set expectations and then validate it with others is, I think, a key part of what we're doing here. It provides a shortcut to much better, quicker conversations, the things that avoid, arguments and personal kind of like emotional kind of arguments at that level and say, look, let's use this language instead. We can resolve it more quickly. Oh, we had a misunderstanding. Never mind. We're using the same language. We're able to resolve it and set some different expectations. All fine. Let's move on. That's a key part of what the Team Topologies language and patterns and techniques are providing.
Thank you, Matthew. I was asked some questions by a listener, and I'll just pick one or two of them if that's okay. What tangible benefits can a software engineering team expect to see from implementing team topologies? And then that's a
great question.
Yeah, the follow-up in the brackets says, and what do you tell the impatient employees, executives who ask, how soon should we expect these results?
Okay, two great questions. So practically speaking, the results inside a software development team, adopting team topologies. So I mentioned before, we can now start to have some expectations about the kind of interactions we're going to have with other teams. We've got a common language to talk to other teams about different ways of working together, collaboration, X as a service, facilitating. And we can also set expectations within our team about what that's going to feel like. Is it going to feel really intense? Do we need to kind of steel ourselves, prepare ourselves for like a few days or maybe a couple of weeks of quite intense work? Because that's going to be really valuable. Then after that, we can relax a bit and go back to something that feels a bit more normal because we're not having that really intense collaboration anymore. So a good chunk of it is about better expectations about how the work is going to feel and what the nature of the communication with other teams is going to be. But there's also other benefits too inside the team. We've got long-term ownership of a particular product or service. We can then achieve what some people call mastery around that. We can work towards that, the mastering that domain, if you like. It's not the best word to use, but anyway, becoming super familiar and confident with that domain, with that area, because we can get right down into the details and we're there responsible for that thing for a decent chunk of time. The design and development decisions we make now will have a long-term effect, and we'll see the effect of those over the coming weeks and months as we're continue to work with that particular service or that product. We're empowered to make decisions, localized decisions that are good for the product. If we can see that we need to rework this particular part of the product to make it easier to change in the future or to make it easier to add a new feature, we're empowered to do that because we're looking after that product, and so on. The boundaries of responsibility are clearer, and just like in a personal level, having clear boundaries is very important for a kind of sense of self and for ultimately for kind of mental well-being. Then clear boundaries are actually very important for a team to have a kind of a clear sense of self and clear and healthy kind of, if you like, team mental well-being. So all of these things should, and this is what we see, this is what we see people telling us, the result of introducing these ways of working ultimately leads to effectively happier, more fulfilled teams. But to answer the second question, like how long does this stuff take? What we're seeing actually, and there's a phrase that someone used the other day. He said, it was a CTO of a company in the UK, and he said, he admitted that he himself had a 2-chapter perspective of team topologies. He'd read the first 2 chapters and he thought, that's enough. I'm done. And his point was that actually lots of management books are very repetitive. You read the first 2 chapters and then the rest of the book is basically the same thing. That's not true with team topologies. Every single chapter is important to read. And to be honest, if you're only going to read 2 chapters, just read the final 2 chapters. That's my secret, effectively. Because we've seen that time and time again, like execs, CEOs, even CTOs, just reading the first little bit and thinking that they understand it all, and they miss out the important stuff towards the end of the book. So some execs start with, this is going to take maybe 3 weeks, because they think it's just about renaming the existing teams and maybe tweaking a few things, and they think it's going to be all done in that time. They're fundamentally misunderstood what we're advocating for here, which is a wholesale shift towards a flow-based operating model. And that is a multi-year program, right? If you already have a flow-based operating model in your organization, then adopting the team topologies kind of language and principles and everything might take a few months. But most organizations are not in that place. I'll give you an example. There's a telecoms company in Europe. We're just awaiting a case study on this right now, but it's in the works. Kind of medium-sized, like 5,000 people. So not huge, but also not tiny. And they've applied team topologies across the whole of the organization, not just in IT, but sales, marketing, HR, blah, blah, blah as well. Now there was already some transformation taking place already. So it was building on some good foundations. They'd be thinking about a Spotify model and more agile teams and blah, blah, blah. So they're in a pretty good place already, but still need some further stuff. Even then, that took basically 2 years to turn around. And obviously that work is still ongoing. So if you're like adopting just the team topologies bits that are specific to team topologies, like the language and the terminology and the interaction modes and things, if you're already super flow aligned, then maybe it's going to take weeks or a small number of months. But in reality, if you're switching from a very project-based organization with lots of silos in place and lots of handoffs and particularly lots of dependencies, have you got teams that have to wait on another team for something before they can get their stuff out the door? If you're in that situation, which most organizations are, then switching to a flow-based operating model inspired by team topologies, you need to expect it to take multiple years. That's just a reality. I mean, to be honest, whether you use team topologies or not, whether you just move to a flow-based model, it's still going to take you a few years. Yeah. This is a wholesale shift in operating model, really, and it depends how far down that journey you already are. But it's definitely not weeks. It's months or years to adopt this kind of approach.
How important is training then, Matthew?
Training and learning in particular. So training is one kind of learning, right? So training is important as a foundational thing, but far more important is to help that learning sink in and to help people apply it. So we have got some online learning with the Team Topologies Academy. Now got 6 courses on there covering pretty much all of the different aspects, but we're introducing more and more over time. But we're increasingly helping organizations to reflect on that learning and to put it into practice alongside some partner organizations and so on, and empowering the organizations themselves to develop those capabilities. So within the work that I do, me and my team act as an external enabling team. So we can use the team topologies principles to describe how we work. We act as an external enabling team, helping to upskill internal enabling teams for them to be able to work across the organization. And yeah, so training's a really key part, but it's kind of learning and putting this stuff into practice and then repeating these new techniques inspired by team topologies, and repeating these techniques, getting into the weeds, getting into the details, and starting to make that change happen over time. So yeah, training is part of it, learning and then putting it into practice becomes the way that this stuff starts to stick.
Thank you, Matthew. One final question for me then. So coming back to cognitive load, what struck me as a kind of a Kanban flow guy myself, reading this, is that one of the things we can do to reduce cognitive load is to reduce busyness, as in people just taking on too much work, starting too much stuff and all that kind of thing. That's probably implicit in how you do things anyway. It just didn't pop out to me in the book. What's your attitude to keeping people busy, Matthew?
Well, it's a great question. So one of the big light bulb moments for me, I think it's probably about, 10 years ago or something, was the idea of work in progress limits. And that comes straight out of lean, obviously, and lean manufacturing and things, where you deliberately limit the amount of stuff that you're doing at the same time, because actually, if you do find the right limit, then you actually get more, the throughput increases. And it's really counterintuitive, because lots of leaders and managers will say, we need all of this stuff to be done. Let's try and do these 20 things at the same time. And it turns out that actually, if you put in a WIP limit of 2 or 3, you'd actually get all that stuff done quicker. It sounds bizarre, it sounds magical, but it's just basic mathematics. So we don't really talk about that too much. In fact, I think we might mention it briefly, but it's these kind of techniques from flow-based approaches that can help really make this stuff work really, really well. And obviously, if we're in a situation where we do have an approach that's more, if we've got an organizational kind of shape that is more flow-based anyway, we've got teams with end-to-end responsibility, streamlined teams, then we're in a better position to introduce kind of flow-based techniques like limiting work in progress and so on, because it makes more sense. Whereas if we've got a project-based approach, there isn't really a sense of particularly work in progress. It's like, I'm just doing this stuff and then it goes out the door, and it's all deadline focused. So it's easier to start introducing things like WIP limits in a kind of team topologies organization, I guess. And yeah, it's absolutely going to be, if you're having to think about 31 different things, that's going to be taking up space in your brain. Basically, you're going to be keeping those in your working memory. That's going to prevent you from learning new things. When we're building and running software systems, we need to learn all the time. The technology is always changing. The domain's always changing. The context is always changing. The nature of how our live system is behaving is changing because it's complex. So we need to have as much space as possible for focusing on looking after that service and evolving that service. If we're having to think about 31 different things that we're supposed to be doing at the same time, then that's not going to be working in our favor. So that's where, yes, reducing busyness can help. Instead of keeping people busy, let's focus on a flow of useful value across the organization.
Agreed. I love the idea of giving people slack. And DeMarco wrote a book about it. Time to think, time to invent, time to create, and time to help each other. Because a lot of people keep themselves all busy, and then they don't have time to help each other. So yeah, I think I'm glad you support that idea as well. So thank you, Matthew, for coming on the Xagility Podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you, John.
Wish you all the best with it. It looks really good to me. I'm really into authentic agility, and I had some initial feelings about team topologies that weren't positive maybe a year ago, but having researched it, feeling quite positive about how it can actually make a difference. And in the right hands, I'm sure people will do wonderful things. Anybody can abuse any approach at the end of the day. It's about what the intents they have about using it. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Super. Thanks, John. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.